This is KhoodeelaarTV Television Channel, broadcasting under the banner of Baby Angel Geronimo Editions. KhoodeelaarTV Television Channel, Part B, 2350 hours GMT, on Sunday, the 29th of January 2023. The baby angel, Geronimo, is witnessing the latest confession by the UK institutions and agencies. On Saturday, the Times columnist Matthew Parris called Boris Johnson a steaming heap of dog mess on Britain's pavement. To my knowledge, that is the most severe imagery that has been used by anyone in the mainstream. Of course, it's not comparable to the extent of the truth of depravity of Boris Johnson and others. But for the mainstream and for the conservative like Matthew Parris, calling Boris Johnson a steaming heap of dog mess on Britain's pavement, is significant confession of the extent of depravity that Boris Johnson actually reached and symbolized and personified. We call him evilness. And the evilness that Boris Johnson personifies and is, of course, not confined to Britain, not confined to white criminals, as the massacre, what is called the crocodile soft genocide, being carried out in Zimbabwe. In the report in today's Sunday Times, page 11, Christina Lamb files the report on one page and some highlights there. 244% of Zimbabwe's inflation rate is the worst in the world, and 200% the interest rate being charged on loans. And $3 is how much a mother of 4 children earns a day selling fruit. And 5 million number of people who have fled overseas. Now, this is the crocodile, and she's saying that wilier and more vicious than Mugabe. Can you imagine? It's like comparing, the worst with the worst. Mugabe was the one that carried out the massacre of the people of Mutabi. Well, massacre and genocide of the people in one of the countries. I have to get the spelling because I'm not familiar with all these various parts of the country, but let's get this right. Yes, this is the massacre that is called In Zimbabwean language, whatever the particular language is, it's called Gukura Hundi. The Gukura Hundi was a genocide in Zimbabwe which arose in 1982 until the Unity Accord in 1987. It derives from a Shona language term. And the Shona language term, Gukurahundi, let's see what it means. The Gukurahundi was carried out in 1983 to 1987, the 4 years. And the Gukurahundi was a genocide in Zimbabwe which arose in 1982 until the Unity Accord in 1987. It derives from a Shona language term which loosely translates to the early rain which washes away the shaft before the spring rains. During the Rhodesian Bush War, two rival nationalist parties, Robert Mugabe's Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU, and Joshua Nkomo's Zimbabwe African People's Union, ZAPU, had emerged to challenge Rhodesia's predominantly white government. ZANU initially defined the Gukurahundi as an ideological strategy aimed at carrying the war into major settlements and individual homesteads. Following Mugabe's accession to power, his government remained threatened by dissidents, disgruntled former guerrillas, and supporters of ZAPU. So Zimbabwe ZANU recruited mainly from the majority Shona people, whereas the ZAPU had its greatest support among the Ndebele and Kalanga peoples. In early 1983, the North Korean trained 5th Brigade, an infantry brigade of the Zimbabwean National Army, ZNA, began a crackdown on dissidents in the Matabele land. That is the name of the place that I was looking for. Matabele land north, Matabele land south, and Midlands provinces, home of the Ndebele and Kalanga people. Over the following 2 years, thousands of Ndebele and Kalanga were detained by government forces and either marched to re-education camps, tortured, raped, and or summarily executed. Although there are different estimates, the consensus of the International Association of Genocide Scholars is that more than 20,000 people were killed. The International Association of Genocide Scholars has classified the massacre as a genocide. And in the entry on Wikipedia, there is a background piece. Before the Rhodesian Bush War, the main black nationalist organization in southern Rhodesia, the Zimbabwe African People's Union, ZAPU, split into two groups in 1963. The split away group being the Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU. Though these groups had a common origin, they gradually grew apart, with the split away group, ZANU, recruiting mainly from the Shona regions, while ZAPU recruited mainly from the Ndebele speaking regions in the west. There is a much earlier source for Shona hostility to the Ndebele, going back to the arrival in 1837 of Zilikazi and his Matabeleland kingdom. Zilikazi carved out a territory for himself by fighting and dispossessing the local Varozvi, led by Changamayar, Krisamb, Changamayar Kirisambhuru, the then patriarch. The armies of these two groups, ZAPU's Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army, ZIPRA, and ZANU's Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army, ZANLA, developed rivalries for the support of the people and would fight each other. When Rhodesia became Zimbabwe in 1980, following the Lancaster House Agreement, that is the Lancaster House Agreement in London, the two armies so distrusted each other that it was difficult to integrate them both into the national army. In the elections held in April 1980, ZANU received 57% out of 100 seats, and Robert Mugabe became prime minister. Dr. Stuart Doran, a historian specializing in Zimbabwe, using historical documents, has written a short article. New documents claim to prove Mugabe ordered Gukurahundi killings way back in 1983. Quoted in part, the documents point to internal killings neither provoked nor sustained by outsiders, suggesting that the atrocities were driven from the top by ZANU PF in pursuit of specific political objectives. Viewed across a period of several years, the documents appear to provide evidence that the massacres were but one component of a sustained and strategic effort to remove all political opposition within 5 years of independence. The ZANU PF leaders were determined to secure a victory against a non existent opposition in electoral elections scheduled for 1985, after which there would be a mandate from the people to impose a one party state. So there is a longer kind of aspect to this article in the Wikipedia entry. And Robert Mugabe, then Prime Minister, had signed an agreement with North Korean leader Kim Il sung in October 1980 to have the North Korean military train a brigade for the Zimbabwean army. This was soon after Mugabe had announced the need for a militia to combat malcontents. Mugabe replied by saying dissidents should watch out, announcing the brigade would be called Gukurahundi. This brigade was named the 5th Brigade. The members of the 5th Brigade were drawn from 3,500 ex-Zanla troops at Tongogara Assembly Point, named after Josiah Tongogara, the Zanla general. There were a few ZAPU troops in the unit for a start, but they were withdrawn before the end of the training. The training of 5th Brigade lasted until September 1982, when Minister Sekeramayi announced training was complete. The first commander of the 5th Brigade was Colonel Perrance Shiri. Perrance is spelled Perrance, Shiri, Shiri. The 5th Brigade was different from all other Zimbabwean army units in that it was directly subordinated to the Prime Minister's office and not integrated to the normal army command structures. Their codes, uniforms, radios, and equipment were not compatible with other army units. The most distinguishing feature in the field was their red berets. In January 1983, a crackdown by the elite 5th Brigade in Matabeleland North was initiated to purge the dissidents, and its participation lasted until late 1984. The brigade's directives apparently specified a search for local Zapu officials and veterans of Zapu's armed wing. Now, all of these people were Zimbabwean, black people, massacring other black people, which is where the reference comes in the context of the murder by beating by 5 black police persons in Memphis, Tennessee, of Tyre Nichols. Now, we go back to the Christina Lamb article and see what is there. Christina Lamb writes, for Jasmine Toffa, the hardest moment of her life was not being beaten black and blue by regime thugs. So Zimbabwe thugs. These are not thugs belonging to the Rhodesian white population. Rhodesia ended. Rhodesia ended in 1980. So for Jasmine Toffa, the hardest moment of her life was not being beaten black and blue by regime thugs. It came when the Zimbabwean MP appeared in parliament after surgery, broken hands in plaster, and the justice minister laughed at her. The single mother of 3 had gone to campaign for a fellow opposition member in council by elections 70 miles from her constituency in the city of Bulawayo. Bulawayo. She was in the house when people came running to warn them that the hoodlums from the ruling party were assaulting anyone wearing opposition yellow. They forced their way in, pulled me out, and started beating me with sticks and branches. I held my hands up to protect my face. They knew I was an MP. They kept saying, Honorable, as they beat me. Honorable, why are you here? Honorable, are you sure you support the opposition leader, Nelson Chamisa? Political violence and repression are nothing new in Zimbabwe, where ZANU PF has been in power since independence in 1980. But with fresh elections due in July 2023, the softening up of voters has begun earlier this time and is unfolding in more sinister ways, leading many to hear. I'm reading this again. But with fresh elections due in July, the softening up of voters has begun earlier this time and is unfolding in more sinister ways, leading many to fear this poll will be the bloodiest yet. It's going to be a massacre if the international community does not intervene, warned Peter Mutasa, head of Crisis in Zimbabwe, a coalition of churches and human rights groups. When Robert Mugabe was ousted in November 2017, people danced in the streets and there was hope of a new dawn. His successor, Emerson Mnangagwa, 80, donned a colorful knitted scarf flew to Davos and declared the country open for business. The British ambassador at the time praised the new president, Mugabe's longtime right hand man, as a pragmatist. On the surface, Zimbabwe remains a beautiful country. This year, tens of thousands of British tourists will marvel at the Victoria Falls, see elephants and rhinos in its national parks, and watch hippos wallow on the Zambezi River. But for most Zimbabweans, life is worse than ever. For Nanangwa, for Nangagwa, for Nangagwa, known as the crocodile, has quashed dissent more brutally than ever and presided over a collapse in living standards while his cronies have prospered. We have jumped from the flying. No, I'm reading that again. We have jumped from the frying pan into the fire, says Chamisa, the opposition leader. When we meet in a secret location, he has survived two assassination attempts. Nangagwa is doing what Mugabe did with a lot more malevolence and maliciousness. Zimbabwe was once a model for the continent, the bread basket of Africa. Today, much of its population is on the verge of starvation. Inflation at 244% and the interest rate at 200% are, are the highest in the world. Three quarters of people of Zimbabwe are unemployed, and corruption has devastated state resources. Restrictions on the media mean this article had to be reported undercover. Nothing works. Daily power cuts last for 20 hours, forcing people to use candles and cook on fires. The vast majority lack access to clean water. Once pristine highways look like war zones, studded with potholes. Asked to buy a ticket at Bulawayo station, and Loveless, the woman in the ticket booth, falls falls about laughing. We haven't had passenger trains for more than 3 years, she says. Nangagwa has taken us back to the dark ages, says Tendai Biti, the former finance minister. This is soft genocide, says the same man. Is it man or woman? Tendai Biti. Most of the population survives by selling to each other on the roadside, turning cities such as Harare into vast street markets. Prices are in US dollars. The real time gross settlement dollar, known as the ZIM dollar, was meant to be on a par when it was introduced in 2019, but currently sells at an unofficial rate of about 1100 ZIM dollars to the US dollar. The American notes in circulation are so worn there is an industry in gluing them together. Those who can escape, those who can escape. A third of the population, 5 million, have fled overseas, a larger exodus than from war zones in Syria and Ukraine. Now, so pausing there to take a kind of look at the narratives against the channel crossing migrants. Now, how many of those people, 5 million Zimbabweans have left the country? 5 million Zimbabweans. I mean, how do you calculate 5 million? Where do they go? Where are they going to? So that is a very direct instance, direct example of how the countries of origin of the people who are leaving their country, becoming refugees and migrants and looking for asylum and so on. That is the kind of thing that I discussed. Of course, not at length in this way, but in my 3-minute broadcast aired on Channel 4 slot in January 1992 when I addressed John Major when he was going to New York to preside over the General Assembly because it was Britain's star turn to chair the General Assembly session. And my comment was prompted by the fact that in the run up to his traveling to the United Nations, John Major had been kind of letting on that he was concerned about some of the countries acquiring or having ambitions to acquire nuclear weapons. Now, nuclear weapons and the kind of campaign that supposedly existed against the proliferation of nuclear weapons represents a different strand, a different kind of angle, very different from the situation that could occur in a country like Zimbabwe. Of course, my broadcast was only 12 years after Zimbabwe became independent, and I wasn't thinking just about Zimbabwe in general terms. I was thinking about a situation where a country domestically becomes unlivable in, untenable, unsurvivable in for most of its people. That was the point I was making in the broadcast. And I was saying that if the West, including John Major's United Kingdom government, if the West didn't address the issue of problems created in the countries of origin, starvation, hunger, and this kind of genocide, then of course people would be forced to look for ways to escape the starvation, hunger, and political kind of instability and insecurity and hunger and the genocide. This is exactly what is happening in Zimbabwe. But now it's not just Zimbabwe. In most of the countries in Africa, including South Africa, there is permanent lack of public safety, ordinary safety for ordinary people. And in a country like say for example in India, which is overly hailed by the Western media as the world's biggest democracy, there are people who don't feel safe. I was speaking to a man from Gujarat. I was speaking to a man from Gujarat about 6 weeks ago, and he said that he was a child in 2002 when the current Prime Minister Narendra Modi was a political figure in the Gujarat province where he comes from. And Modi colluded with the Hindu fundamentalists, attacking Muslims. And this man that I spoke to is a Muslim from Gujarat. How old is he? I think he would be in his late 30s or early 40s. Well, if he was a child, I don't know how old he was. If he was a child in 2002, then he could be in his late 20s or early 30s. Can't be exact about his age because I didn't ask him about his age, but I'm just guessing based on the contents of his conversation with me. And he said that he left Gujarat or India because he didn't feel safe. But there is nothing. There is nothing of that feeling in, say, for example, the Financial Times, the Weekend FT, the piece that I discussed earlier in part A and also in part A yesterday, where the heading is India against Gandhi. That is a reference to MK Gandhi, not Indira Gandhi. Now, there is no acknowledgement of the terrible lack of security felt by so many people in the world's biggest democracy that the UK media repeatedly refers to when referring to India, which is not the world's biggest democracy at all. And what is happening in the aftermath of the unresolved massacre of Muslims in 2002 is that the Supreme Court and the court system in India is dragging on instead of deciding on the crimes against humanity that criminals like Narendra Modi committed. They're dragging that whole thing on so that Narendra Modi, who is the front man for the coalition of fascistic Hindutva fundamentalists, RSS, Rashtriya Samsavak Sangha, and others like him, can stay in power and cause the maximum damage to basic human rights of the people that are targeted, that remain targeted by them. And so therefore, in the aftermath of the beating to death, the murder by 5 black-skinned policemen of Tyre Nichols, I don't know how they pronounce his name, but Tyre Nichols, let's say, it has to be realized that the actual mentality, the outlook of black people, black-skinned people, black-born people towards other black people is as significant, as culpable, as responsible, as substantial as the attitude of the white racists towards and against black people. But it is never acknowledged as that. In the general commentary and the general observations, crimes by black-skinned people against other black-skinned people are treated as being lower caliber than crimes by racist white ones against black-skinned people. That should not be the case. Every violation of a person, no matter what the color or ethnicity of the violator is, must be treated as equal. That has not happened, but that must happen. Because after the movement called, what did they call it? They called it Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter was an easy slogan to confect. But did the people who originated that slogan into the banner of the campaign, did they actually examine the evidence? Did they actually examine the evidence of who makes the Black Lives not matter? I'm referring, of course, to these 5 criminals, black-skinned criminals that were wearing the Memphis, Tennessee police department uniform as they were beating to death this innocent, absolutely innocent man who was crying to go home and was crying for his mom as they were killing him, murdering him. Now, how do you describe these 5 murderers that were murdering him? All 5 of them were murdering him as he was crying, Mom, Mom, Mom. What were they thinking? So, when in the Quran, Holy Quran, there is this Surah Al Isra, and it says that there are two angels on the 2 shoulders of every human being. One recording the bad things that the individual does, and one recording the good things that the individual does. And these would be the authentic records produced on the day of judgment in the hereafter. Now, where did these 5 evil ones lose that insight, that knowledge? Of course, they are not necessarily expected to be familiar with what is said in the Holy Quran, but in their upbringing, where did they get brought up? And where did they lose all contacts with humanity? Not every human being is supposed to be a Muslim. I don't expect them to be Muslim. I don't expect them to be familiar with the Holy Quran. But every human being who is raised, brought up, is supposed to be brought up and raised with basic tenets of life, tenets and duties for life. So, where did they lose that sense of whatever they should have understood as duty? How did they manage, all 5 of them, to decide that this lone individual, he was not committing a crime? He was simply driving home and he was trying to get home. That he was somebody that they should have attacked. It's like the behavior, the mentality of that London Metropolitan Police constable who was armed police constable. There has been, somebody has pointed out in a letter in the Times that David Carrick, who is also armed, was not an elite policeman. Now, elite and armed are two different things. Now, in their descriptions of these 5 thugs, there has been reference to use of the word elite, because apparently they belong to the unit called Scorpion. Whoever appointed them to Scorpion and assigned them to Scorpion, I mean, what did they think of these kind of recruits to the Scorpion, the so-called elite unit in Memphis? What fitness did they have? If anyone checked on their fitness, what were they looking for by way of fitness? Because their behavior is not exceptional. The only thing that is exceptional, I mean, I have been studying the reports and dispatches and books and studies about the USA, and of course, in the context of the racist composition of the society and the state. I've been studying it for as long as I've been studying anything. And the one thing that actually comes out extraordinarily about the USA is this thing about this murder of this Tyre Nichols. I am being limited in my pronunciation. I may be getting it wrong, but I am only pronouncing it as best as I can based on the spelling of it. Tyre Nichols, or I can call it Tyre Nichols. The manufacture of many of the theories to justify inciting hatred against Muslims has been kind of aided and abetted by the ones that created that so-called 9/11 attacks. There is absolutely no evidence. There is absolutely no evidence in any treatise, any interpretations of the Prophet's legacies and the Prophet's kind of teachings. And there most certainly is nothing in the Holy Quran directly, nor in any of the interpretations of the Holy Quran by any of the scholars, either at the time when the Quran was being revealed or since. And I say that again, I can't say it strongly enough. There is nothing in Islam that is based on the Quran, based on the hadiths of the Prophet, or of the observations of various Islamic scholars that remotely suggests that a single innocent life should be harmed. There is not. In fact, the opposite. Any act of compassion, any act of kindness, any act of generosity is hugely to be rewarded in the hereafter. That is the promise. And that is consistent with the rest of the Islamic manifesto for the humanity. So no Muslim would do any terror. No Muslim would do any damage to even one innocent human being. Anyone who does that, anyone who causes any harm, any damage, or any detriment or inconvenience or distress to an innocent person, non-combatant, and says that they're doing the damage in the name of Islam, is not doing so in the name of Islam. They are lying. They may have a name, Islamic name, but they're lying. The other dimension, of course, is a standard formula used by the Saitans and Satan's followers. There is a whole kind of pattern of so-called recruits to Islam. I mean, highly disproportionate number of so-called recruits to Islam are found on the evidence to have been involved in terrorist plots. So that recruitment is a device. It's not a spontaneous moral, spiritual acceptance of Islam. It's a device so that also provocateurs can do the maximum damage and blame Islam. That is what is happening. So what happened in September 2001 must have been the work of also provocateurs being handled and operated by layers and layers of others. Because, I mean, the people, whoever was harmed, were innocent people. And the maximum outcome of that series of plotted attacks on the innocent people has been to launch and justify attacks on innocent Muslim people thousands of miles away. In Afghanistan, in Iraq. So none of the studies, none of the examination, the investigations carried out for the last 20 years plus has shown that there was any Islamic involvement in anything that was done there or in other locations in the world. So that is something that is absolutely solid. And going back to the murder by these 5 black-skinned criminals in Memphis, Tennessee, the question is, when a black-skinned person, in the context, let's say, bearing in mind the whole narrative, the commentary about the slave trade, when a black-skinned person is given any position, any authority in an environment, in a society that is otherwise 90% of it being controlled by non-black persons, what should that black person do by the power that they are allowed to have? And the answer is that their task is many times more arduous than it would be if they were in an equal society. So, instead of being absolute evil, these 5 police individuals, their task was to behave with generosity, with compassion, And with that additional understanding and dimension that they would have if they were at the receiving end of attacks by a racist policeman and they were in civilian positions and not wearing uniforms either in Memphis or anywhere else. For example, it is well established by evidence that black man, that is, black man of African, mainly African background and origin, African descent, African heritage, etc. Black man, especially young black man, let's say under 40 years old, but it sometimes can exceed that age range, are stereotyped excessively, and they are violated. They're attacked, they're beaten, they're arrested, and they're blamed, they're demonized. Now, that process is already established by centuries. Let's say more than 100 years, nearly 200 years of experience of black people being treated in that way. Black here meaning African origin black people. Either they come from Africa through the slave route or they come from some of the Caribbean countries. Now, if the accusation against these black people, black man, is made by ordinary white people, that is treated as enough, sufficient evidence to justify brutalizing and attacking the black person under accusation. Now, Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, the advocacy by her father, she modeled her character, Atticus Finch, on her real life father's experience as a lawyer. And it is absolutely compelling. Now, how do you categorize Harper Lee? She is a white woman, and what she wrote, it excels anything else that exists. So, should the focus be on her race? Most certainly not. The focus should be and must be on her humanity. So, where did these five murderers, all black skinned, lose their humanity? And to extrapolate that loss of humanity, what are the colleges, what are the schools, the black controlled colleges and black schools, what are they teaching? Why isn't there a dominant narrative among the black people of African origin? Because the recipients of dehumanization disproportionately is very largely experienced by black people of African origin. That's why. Why isn't there a narrative? Why hasn't there been a narrative that black person inherently must respect other black persons in a significant way so that the other black person feels humanely treated, feels treated as a human being who has been treated with compassion, real respect, and dignity. Why is it, for example, in that film that Coming to America, that Eddie Murphy played, the leading role in the barber shop. In the barber shop, the conversation between a black man and a Jewish elderly man. I mean, if you look at the actual action, black people completely dismiss other black people. It's not like partly dismiss, they completely dismiss other black people. Why, why does this happen? Where does it originate? In the upbringing of the child to the child's adulthood. Say, for example, where is the sense of justice? If the child hears and overhears and observes black people being treated, dehumanized by white people, that is to say, racists, then shouldn't that observing child, individual, grow up to oppose that kind of behavior and to practice the opposition themselves? I mean, there is not one, but there are about 90% of the British academic work and 95%, I would say, of the media contents. I mean, I refer to the apology that the Guardian's journalists belatedly expressed to Bibek Chaudhry, who had worked for the Guardian or at the Guardian for 15 years. I mean, why should the Guardian not have accepted Bibek Chaudhry as an equal? And why was he denied the support and solidarity by other journalists on the Guardian? And why did he have to do so much extra work in order to extract a reluctant apology from the Guardian? In the kind of heyday, in the kind of most active periods of the GLC, the Greater London Council, say between May 1981 up to the period when Margaret Thatcher's government began proceedings in terms of changes in the legislation to scrap the GLC, say about 3-4 years. In 3-4 years, the GLC leadership, fronted by Ken Livingstone Livingstone, allocated millions of pounds, allocated and spent millions of pounds of public money, GLC money, to those groups across London that the new GLC knew would spend considerable time of their organizations in making specific events in praise of the GLC generally and in praise of Ken Livingstone Livingstone in particular. Now, the highest amount of money that the GLC gave was to Rifraf Ali. Rifraf Ali comes from the Caribbean, but is of Indian origin. And Rifraf Ali received undisclosed amount, but significant amounts of money so that he could spend a lot of money on his own living, housing, and he eventually published two titles, mainly the Caribbean Times, and then he experimented with the Asian Times. The Caribbean Times is the one that he actually focused on. And my reading, my audit, my observation would suggest that the Caribbean Times was totally 100% funded by Ken Livingston-led GLC to praise Ken Livingston. Now, I started writing many years before Rifraf Ali even arrived in the field of so-called journalism. He never was a journalist, but I started reporting the beginning of the 1960s. Now, as I have said before, I never wrote, I never did that as part of a generating income exercise. That was the only difference. Otherwise, the quality and the contents of my research and my observation and my predictions have remained consistently far higher than anything that can be found anywhere else in anybody else's writing or journalism. So, by that definition alone, I would be entitled to the higher grade of the remuneration than the average contributor. But in all the years that I spent time, energy, resource in producing copy for the benefit of the society, not for my career, and made it available to the likes of Rifraf Ali, at no point did the criminals like Rifraf Ali show the basic common sense and offer even the costs of traveling, because I would have to personally travel in order to deliver the items that I wrote for the publications. The only time that I was able to get some course, part of the course, was when Alfred Tang Chao, of Chinese origin but coming from the Caribbean, was in control of the West Indian world. Amazingly, every time he made 25 pounds available to me, it had to be a struggle, a battle. I mean, he could not ever begin to pay for one single column that I wrote. Column that he himself admitted was the main point of attraction for his readers. He could not pay. So, what I'm looking at is the dehumanization, the lack of humanity on the part of black people towards other black people, no matter what their contributions are. So, when racists comment, for example, somebody has said, well, one of the writers, a Greek writer called Haque, who long wrote in the Spectator in the UK, he said that African people are very stupid. Now, why would he make that comment? If you look at the interactions among African people, Asian people, you'd find the level of conversation lowered from the level of conversation that the same people would have or maintain if they were conversing or communicating with white people. Why is that? Where does it come from? For example, as I said many times, and I'm saying again, the decision by Lenny Henry to create his career by openly, brazenly mocking African people, the first 10 years of his career. How did he do that? Where did he kind of get the rationale? He didn't do the same thing by mocking and ridiculing white people. I'm not saying that he should have done, but he focused on African people and ridiculed them to a point where no white comedian had done that or would have done that because there would be protests. Which takes me to the point of black people murdering other black people, doing damage to other black people physically. And the extreme case, of course, is this Memphis, Tennessee murder by 5 black skinned police persons murdering a innocent black man. In the case of the what is called black on black crimes in the UK, as I have said, there is absolutely no organized, noticeable outrage that this is happening. Why does it happen? Where do these murderers and these violent thugs and criminals get their motivation from? So we shall be talking more about all of these in the later editions, not necessarily today but in future. And we shall be continuing to read about the crocodile's soft genocide that the crocodile is perpetrating in Zimbabwe. As I said, not in this edition, but in a previous edition, the genocide of of Rwanda was done by black people on black people. I mean, where did they get the motivation from? And why has Rwanda been completely overturned in terms of the lessons, in terms of the reasons, to a point where Priti Patel and Braverman and Sunak, they think Rwanda is a wonderful place? Have they no shame? Would they send asylum seekers, let's say Jewish asylum seekers, if that was possible, to either Poland or in Germany, where the Nazis massacred Jewish people? They would not dare even say the words. And yet they have been making Rwanda look like a holiday destination. The promotion in the USA media of this black woman whom they are praising. Now, this is sinister. They're praising this black woman because they're saying that she is kind of diffusing the tension. How dare they? What do they mean by diffusing the tension? This is part of a genocidist plot. Genocide has been taking place in Zimbabwe and also in America. Only the mode of the genocide is different. We shall be talking more about all of that in later editions, future editions. This broadcast has been just over 1 hour and 11 minutes long, and we are bringing an end to this at just before 1 o'clock, 0100 hours GMT on Monday, the 30th of January 2023.